Welcome to the Exodus Cry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
Heidi, I'm so glad that you are joining us for our podcast. We had a chance to meet up in DC for the symposium that we're doing related to this subject of childhood exposure to pornography. And since we have started to sound the alarm that this is an issue, we've noticed a ton of people kind of come out of the woodwork that share this concern of children being exposed to pornography. And I say that distinct from children having access to pornography because I think the real issue is children being inadvertently exposed just by virtue of being online, whether or not they're seeking it out. Anyways, I was very moved by hearing you share about this subject from the perspective of a nurse. And I'm going to butcher your title if I attempt it.
It's okay.
So maybe you could just start out and just share a little bit of your background and the specific focus that you have as a nurse.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I actually did not know that I was in your documentary until one of my colleagues was like, hey, I just saw you in this. So that was a really fun surprise. But I also am really concerned about this issue. And I started to see this trend about 8 years ago when I became a sexual assault nurse examiner. So for many people who have never heard that title, essentially what that means is that as a nurse, I take care of kids specifically who have been sexually assaulted. And part of my job is collecting forensic evidence off their bodies after an assault. And part of it is making sure they're medically stable and healthy and kind of addressing medical issues that go with sexual assault, like STDs, things like that. And then also just assessing them holistically, seeing what their mental health is like, sort of what their living situation is like, things like that, kind of before we discharge them, making sure that they're as okay as they can be after a traumatic event like that. So that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years, but I have seen a huge trend of kids who are sexually assaulting other kids. And a lot of it can be traced back to, in part, exposure to pornography influencing that behavior.
Thank you for what you're doing. You're truly on the front lines of such an egregious issue. I don't know how else to say it. It's so deeply disturbing and visceral. And I'm sure you hear this. We hear it all the time. I don't know how you do what you do. I mean, I would almost say that to you, like, I don't know how do you do what you do. Because we had our experience sort of with that when we came upon the pajamas of a girl that had been sexually abused in Cambodia and were still stained with the blood from her abuse. And that was just such a galvanizing, polarizing moment for us as a staff to really see the full weight of the impact of and the reality of what's happening to these children. But then also we were able to do the math and go, that's the end result of somebody else's porn addiction who got to a point where they felt like, now I need to go act this out. And, so a lot of these people are flying to countries like Cambodia where they can find a more vulnerable population to enact these fantasies. But tell me more about, in your experience, there's so much that I want to say right now to you. There's so many questions I want to ask. So one at a time. All right. So first of all, how do you cope with that? How do you cope with your own exposure to the reality of these situations where literally children are being sexually abused?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's probably the thing that I get asked the most, actually, around my job, which makes sense. Like you're saying, it's very brutal to be on the front lines of it in some ways. And in other ways, it's really rewarding to be able to sit with a patient or their family and offer empathy and validation in that moment can be really meaningful, to be the first safe person that they've encountered or someone that believes them. So I feel a lot of honor in being able to do that. But of course, there is all of this vicarious trauma that you're seeing, hearing, witnessing these really awful, awful things. So I think I think it's sort of twofold, but one, I've had to learn to know when I'm depleted. So I think a lot of times people in this work can have a savior complex, of I have to rescue these kids. I have to be the one to do this. Nobody else will. And I think that's can be a dangerous road to go down. You'll burn yourself out so fast. So I think being able to set boundaries around, it's not all dependent on me. I'm allowed to take care of myself. Like having to learn that it was not something I just innately knew how to do in this work. So it's been several years of a journey of sort of figuring out when I'm depleted, how do I take care of myself and how do I set boundaries around not being inundated with this day in, day out. And I think also just knowing what fills me back up and what makes me feel whole again after just experiencing so much darkness. So I think that there's it's multi-fold in how to deal with this. I think you also have to feel called to do this kind of work. It's not for everybody. And I think anyone in this work should go to therapy as well to be able to process with someone without traumatizing their family or whoever it may be of, guess what I just saw at work today. So I think there's lots of layers to staying healthy and being in this work.
Yeah, because there is that ebb and flow of walking this out where there are, we are exposed to these very traumatic situations, but then have to go back to living your life as well. I guess the thing that happens is it's so arresting that you're just kind of pulled into that trauma in a way that affects the rest of your life. So if you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear more about specifically what are those things for you where you find that balance and that ebb and flow? Are there practical things that have been helpful? And again, just thinking of our audience, there's a lot of people that are in this movement with us who share this passion. And I think it'd be really helpful insight just to hear from your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I've had to learn how to do is be really in tune with my body. So to know, in these moments, we subconsciously cope with things like maybe I'm really tense when I'm seeing a patient or something like that. And then I leave and I have to check in with myself of, am I holding all this tension? Do I feel really exhausted? Do I feel depleted? Am I angry at the world? Kind of checking in all of the parts of me holistically of how am I doing? So then I can say, what do I need? So for me personally, what makes me feel a lot better is being outside. So, a lot of times I'll take my dog for a walk or we'll go to the dog park or, whatever it may be. It's just something outside that makes me feel sort of like this reset button after just being in this dark space. I think also just being around community that can handle that type of darkness. Because there are people that I'll talk to about my job and say like, oh, heck no. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. Please don't tell us what you do. And that's okay. I think for a lot of people, they have their own trauma that triggers as soon as they hear this, what I'm doing. It's kind of like, oh no, I don't want to go there, or I can't handle that, which is okay. Not everybody, has to be forced into sort of hearing about this. But I think to have community that's willing to say it's okay to talk about those things. We want to support you. What do you want to share? What do you need right now? Has been really helpful to know that, I'm not sharing this burden by myself. Yeah. And I think too, just have encouragement, of people saying, you're doing a great job, or how can we help you? What do you need? So those I think would be some of the main things, is kind of figuring out physically what I need in the moment, and also just sort of emotionally what's supportive as well.
It's interesting what you say about listening to your body, because for me, I would say there was a period of time where I just always felt like crap. And so I would hear people say that and be like, I don't even know what that means. I feel like dying.
Right.
Just from the standpoint of just going so hard for so long and not preaching having balance, but not living it, because people would be like, well, how do you do it? I don't know. Yeah, you got to have balance. But in my head, I'm like, whatever that means, I'm like, and I was starting to manifest physical ailments, like lower back issues, and just a whole handful of things. And it wasn't until I started doing some yoga classes and my back issues started to go away. and I started to feel better in my physical body. And I've become much more sensitive to like listening to my body. I actually have like a framework now for what that means. Yeah. And you talked about the reset, like doing a cold plunge has the effect of kind of resetting your nervous system.
Yes.
Where your primal instincts, survival instincts kick in, your body thinks it's going to die and it kind of like resets itself. I can't fully explain it, but it's another thing that's like helped me to get more in tune and in touch with my body. I feel like I'm in a much healthier place than I've ever been in this. But with the therapy piece, so let me just kind of put a side note to this conversation for a second, because for those of us that have been in this for a while, remind me again how long you've been doing the sexual assault.
I've been a sexual assault nurse for 8 years.
Okay. So yeah, that's a good chunk of time.
Yes.
That's enough to add up a few traumas.
Right.
And I met one colleague in the field whose name I'm sure you would know, and have been at it for decades, and had so there's also like the coping mechanisms as well when you don't have healthy outlets and all the things that you've tapped into, community, all those things, therapy. And she had developed a pretty severe drinking problem, and not like going out partying, but like just trying to cope with all the cumulative trauma of being in this. I think that's a very natural thing. Like this idea that pain seeks pleasure or pain seeks comfort, you know? And so she was helped by a therapist to get through that, and has become a very healthy person, who also connected me to this therapist who's helped me tremendously. But I think just in my own life, I've developed a much more personal connection to the need for self-care, not as like a something on a checklist, but like it's very real. It's very real to me. You can die in this work, like, you know, through either coping mechanisms or self-harm or inadvertent self-harm, or, you know, there's so many ways. And so, yeah, I really have a high value for the things that you're describing that you're doing, because I'm just a huge advocate for that now. So thinking of people who have been at this for a while, who have been addressing issues of child exploitation and sex trafficking and all of that. Again, just coming from that nursing perspective and applying these things to your own life, is there any wisdom that you would give to somebody like me or somebody else out there that's maybe struggling with kind of how to sustain this?
That's a great question. I agree with everything that you're saying. And so I actually managed our sexual assault nurse examiner program for 5 years. And so I was reading every single sexual assault disclosure that was coming through our hospital doors day in, day out. And I think it almost becomes normal, you know, like this heightened sense of trauma that you're in becomes normal. And I think that can be really dangerous as well, that it's almost like being in this elevated sort of hypervigilant space is how we function. It's definitely how I was functioning. And so I stepped out of that last year. And I think to just have a little bit of, I still do it part-time, but even just like some breathing room, I think it was so important for me to see some of these things are not healthy. It's not healthy to, like, I know someone has to do it, but for year after year to just be inundated with all of this really dark, horrific, you know, imagery that's going through your head, or even, you know, I would watch our nurses film our exams, which that's a whole nother thing of why we do that. But to watch every single one, seeing all these injuries and different things, I think it's okay to take a step back, I guess is my point, is to say for things to stay sustainable, to take a step back and say, I can still be useful. I can still make a difference. I can still fulfill my purpose, but I don't have to be the one, the savior in all of this, And so I think that is really important to have that healthy balance of I can still do what I feel called to do or what I'm good at or what I've been gifted in, but it's not my job to save the world or every hurting child. Like that's not possible for anyone to do. But I think sometimes we get sucked into that.
Yeah.
So I think that that's been important for me to step back and learn as well is just like you're saying, I have to take care of myself. Otherwise, I'm going to completely burn out and then not want to do any of this work.
Yeah, that's good. Because it is, like we've said, it is one of those things that is all consuming. Like there's this, when you've had like sort of an awakening to the reality of what's happening in our culture related to sexual abuse and all of that, there is part of it is like, I will give my dying last breath to change this, but then there's our human capacities that run out over a period of time, and all that noble ambition hits a wall. And so, and then we've got to really reconcile with, okay, I'm not, every sexual abuse victim's savior. Like,
right.
I wish I could be, but I'm not. And like having to, the humility and vulnerability of having to acknowledge and own and accept and be content with our own limitations as a part of actually, ironically, sustaining the effort over a longer period of time. I think that's so wise. And so you're really, on the front lines of an issue that is unfortunately inherent to our culture. There are demographics of children who are sexually abused in our culture. And we hate that. We don't want that, but it is there. And I think that for most people, they don't want to hear about it. You hear the statistics cited, like there's 1 in 3 children or 1 in 4 children that are sexually abused. And we hear those things. Nobody ever thinks logically the fact that there are actually angels of our society on the front lines who are holding those children in the place of their exploitation. And just thank you for doing that. First of all, that's incredible. And I think we all owe you a huge debt of gratitude to do that. Again, it's not something that we think that through all the time, that there are people there in that position to do that. That's deeply meaningful and I know has come at a cost. It comes at a personal cost. So I've been kind of dancing around to get to this point, but what more can you tell us about the exploitation itself? Now, I just want to preface that a little bit for our audience that we want to frame as safe a conversation as we can around this subject, but it's very disturbing in its nature. And for my part, I would love to learn more from you about what you're seeing related to the issue of children being sexually abused, and particularly by either adults or peers where pornography has been involved. Because there's a sentiment that pornography is harmless, that it's just, to get your erotic thrill or whatever. All the things that we know, it's empowering, blah, blah, blah. And then to criticize it is to be anti-sex. It's the most bizarre argument.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important for us to understand in a very concrete way how pornography is actually really contributing towards this crisis and this pandemic of global childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah. So I have so many things I could say along those lines. I'll try and be succinct, but I never started out thinking that this is something I would be speaking out about. I did not become a sexual assault nurse examiner because I thought I would be talking about pornography. Like if you had told me, 10 years ago, hey, this is what you're going to be doing, I would have like, no, never. I do not want to do that. But because I was seeing just the devastating impacts that porn is having on kids, I felt like I can't not say something. How come nobody around me is talking about this? Surely I'm not the only one seeing this trend, which of course I'm not. I was just working with a child advocacy center on the other. So I live in Kansas City. So I live on the western side of the state. I'm working with a child advocacy center on the eastern side of the state. And they're saying, we are seeing the same trend every single day. Every day we're seeing kids who are being sexually abused by other kids, and porn is a factor. So I'm seeing it in Kansas City. They're
every
seeing
day.
it every day in St. Louis. This trend is happening all over the United States all the time.
So not 2 or 3 kids a year.
Right. So it's
every day.
Every day is what they're telling me. And we are seeing the same, I wouldn't say exactly the same trend, but that there's a very high number of kids where I live. And again, it's not happening in a vacuum in the Midwest. All over the United States, this is happening with increased frequency. So the way that I started to sort of go down this rabbit trail is when I first became a SANE nurse, no one talked to me about this. I didn't know that kids were sexually assaulting other kids. The way I found it out is because every patient I was seeing was being sexually assaulted by another child. So I was writing down perpetrators' ages, and it's an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old. And just the way my brain works is I'm thinking, why is this happening? What is happening? What is driving this? This is not normal. So, and these are not, I'm not talking about like normal exploratory developmental type of things between kids. I'm talking about something that constitutes as sexual violence, sexually violating another child. So I started to dig into the data at our hospital and started to see we have an astronomical number of minors who are committing sexual assault. So on any given year, it's anywhere from about a third to half of those who are committing sexual assaults against children are kids themselves. And we see a really high volume of kids where I work. So this is not just like 5 kids that we're getting this data from. It's hundreds and hundreds of kids that we're pulling this data from. So it's super disturbing. And of course, as I started to look back through our charts, hear disclosures from patients, from parents, pornography is often an influencer. So of course, it's not the only reason why a child will sexually act out. But as pornography has become more and more accessible, we know it's so violent. Of course, kids are going to act out what they're seeing. And we're watching it manifest in front of us in that there's so many kids who are acting out what they're seeing, traumatizing other children through that, or with teens, just these crazy violent scenarios where, we'll have a teenage boy who assaults another girl and just enacting every scene that they see in porn, from strangulation to, raping multiple times, to ejaculating on their face, to calling them a name and then being done, leaving with no empathy whatsoever. That's straight out of porn. So this is a trend that's on the rise.
Wow. Well, first, just kind of pulling back macro lens for a moment. If we just have this conversation on the premise that, there are kids being sexually abused and pornography is a part of that, there's sort of this like debate that emerges about, well, you can't prove that. There's 2 sides to this. But just pulling back for a second, the idea of global access to the most graphic, hardcore, body punishing sex acts imaginable is very new to our society, just from a anthropological, evolutionary, social evolutionary perspective. It's a very new phenomenon. So I think it's important to recognize that, because it puts more weight on, we need to take seriously the crisis that we're in the middle of right now. It's not something where we go, well, it's just always the way it's been. It's like, no, it's not always the way it's been. There's a new phenomenon that has emerged in our world that is having a devastating consequence on the lives of untold numbers of children.
Yeah.
And so I think that we're at this moment where a lot of people are still stuck either in defensive mode, don't threaten my pornography, or, whatever, or for the people who are making it, don't threaten my income. And then there's the crowd who just has their head in the sand. They just, it's too disturbing. I don't want to think or deal with it. But no, it's a real crisis. It is a real crisis. And it's so just at a very macro level, I think it's important to acknowledge the uniqueness of this moment, for us to have conversations like this, to take an inventory for where we're at and what is going on. And then so that we can honestly begin to say, okay, how do we actually now address this crisis in a more concrete, substantive way to protect not just this generation of children, but future generations of children as well. From more of like a micro perspective, there's also the risk with a conversation like this that some people would hear the information, and again, because it is so inherently disturbing, and it just kind of like they almost can't fathom it. They can't process or place it. Are there any stories that have like touched you, or that you feel could maybe help bring some perspective to some of what you're talking about that stand out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, as I hear this from people a lot as well, as, I've looked at porn. I've never sexually assaulted someone. You can't prove that correlation, but we actually can. There are lots of peer-reviewed, published research that's well done that shows kids are more susceptible to what they see in porn. The more they watch pornography, the more likely it is that they will act it out. We see these two things go hand in hand. So, no, not every kid who sees porn is going to commit a sexual assault. But is it an influencer in a kid assaulting someone? Oh, yeah. Especially when they are looking at this really violent content all the time. Of course, it's going to have an effect on them. It has an effect on adults who sexually abuse kids. So these things, there's definitely research behind it. I think for people who just want to dismiss it, there are actual published studies of this. And I would say our data is not unique at my hospital. Again, these trends are happening everywhere. But more onto a personal note, yes, I can think of so many patients where that correlation was extremely clear. So for example, we took care of a 13-year-old female at our hospital, and she had come in and told us, my 16-year-old brother was looking at pornography. He came into my room and said, I can't stop thinking about what I was watching, and he raped her. I mean, you see the direct connection of, this is in my mind, I want to act it out. Now we have this traumatized 13-year-old. And we see patient after patient like that. There are patients that maybe don't necessarily explicitly say pornography was involved, but you can see its fingerprints all over. So I took care of a 15-year-old who was brutally raped by another 15-year-old boy from school. And I mean, it was an awful assault. She had multiple genital injuries. And I remember as I was talking to her, I asked her, had she been strangled? That's a question that we ask. Of course, that's a huge part of pornography. And she said, yeah, he strangled me, but I think he was trying to be sexy. And I had to stop for a second and think, wait, you are describing how you were raped by this 15-year-old boy, but strangulation doesn't feel like a scary part of it to you. What is the disconnect here, right? But also it's probably in my mind because she's also watched pornography. She sees females be strangled in it. And this feels like a normal sexual interaction almost. And I've heard that many times from girls we see that are assaulted. They don't tell us they're being strangled because they don't see that as a part of their assault. And so it's really interesting and very depressing and awful, really, the way that porn is teaching girls, you should just accept these really violent things because that's what they do in porn. And for boys, you should be doing these things. You should be strangling these girls. You should not show any empathy. So it's playing out in so many ways, but I see it repeatedly with patients.
For somebody like her who's been in that scenario, where do you think, I'm just trying to kind of imagine where her head was at. So she's being raped, but in her head, she consciously can sort of recognize that he maybe isn't thinking of it as a rape. He's being like a sexual prowess or?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like she was minimizing certain elements of it, that it's like, obviously she could disclose on some level of, I was violated. I didn't consent to this, rape that happened. but then there are other pieces of it that she almost didn't view as part of her assault, which was really interesting. And I think pornography is grooming kids into thinking some parts of sexual, violence are normal.
Wow. I think that is to me, I think one of the scariest trends in this is when people begin to internalize these very, these highly abusive sexual scenarios as something to be desired or as something to accept, and then participate in their own sexual violation by way of conditioning. Mm-hmm. And for anyone who does think, oh, porn can't be blamed for that, I'm not one of those people that's going to say, oh, porn's responsible for all the evils in the world, just as like kind of like a blanket statement. But I do think in very specific ways, if we're being completely honest, again, and based on a lot of years and years of research into this as well, if the companies spend billions of dollars on marketing because it works. Mm-hmm. So if the idea of a halftime Super Bowl commercial that cost $5 million to air of somebody, Paris Hilton eating a cheeseburger or whatever, the idea is that other people are going to want to eat that cheeseburger. That's the power of image-based marketing. And so to take something as potent as pornography and to continue to pump it out there to the masses, especially to the undeveloped brain of a child who's literally neurologically overwhelmed in the experience of being exposed to those images, that it's not going to affect them? Oh yeah, that's just going to passively wash off of them? Like, no, of course it's going to create an appetite. So I had this argument when I was interviewing pornographers. A lot of them were like, no, that pornographer is a satiator of sexual appetites, not a cultivator of sexual appetites. And it's just not true.
Right.
It's absolutely a cultivator of sexual appetites. I mean, the fact that 14-year-olds are strangling each other in a sexual scenario, it shows the rapid acceleration of how deviant and abusive sexuality has become for this generation. And at this point, it's like almost impossible to separate modern sexuality from pornography. And I don't know, lots more to say about that, but just in terms of quantifying not only the impact of the sexual abuse on these poor children who have endured that, but of pornography on the perpetrators. Are you aware of any peer-reviewed research that is currently underway to help tell that story, so that more people will begin to take note of this and take it more seriously? I mean, I feel like you are in a way kind of reporting to us from the front lines going, I'm seeing I'm seeing people get blown up on the front lines and body parts are flying off and nobody knows. And like, is there any more being done to help bring the wreckage to bear on a more conscious cultural level?
Yeah, there is. And I feel like actually people are talking about it a lot more than they were even 5 years ago, which brings me hope that at least frontline workers were all admitting to each other now, like, yeah, this is absolutely happening all the time. But I participated in a research study. I'm not sure when it will be published. It's currently in the works, that several universities had worked together to work on. And they interviewed 50 frontline workers from all over the world who are seeing these same trends. And so at some point, hopefully that will be published soon. And I think it's going to be published in a very prestigious type of journal. So, you unfortunately, I think in some ways have to have that research to be taken seriously in certain places. It's not enough to just say, hey, I'm seeing this, it's real. You have to have sort of that current research behind it, even though I think to anyone who can stop and think about it, it makes so much sense. Just like you're saying, a kid seeing violent porn over and over and over again, it's going to affect them some way. And so that's exciting that that's coming out. And I know there are other studies in the works as well. And it just keeps being published. I mean, there's a lot of current research over the last 2 or 3 years showing this correlation between porn influencing kids in harmful sexual behaviors.
Most kids have been exposed to pornography by age 13. Some are addicted even as young as 6. So how is pornography shaping the lives of impressionable children and adolescents? Our documentary, Raised on Porn, exposes the ways pornography has become the new sex education for children and unpacks the dangerous lifelong implications of this global phenomenon.
I was like, this is my chance of actually getting pornography for myself.
The film features real stories of childhood exposure, paired with experts who weigh in on the reality children are facing.
It's absolutely impossible for them to resist this kind of stimulus.
It's already garnered millions of views, and 93% of viewers polled said it inspired them to be more proactive in protecting their children from porn. You can watch Raised on Porn for free on YouTube or go to raisedonporn.com.
You started a consultation company to actually begin to help others learn about what's going on. Can you tell us a little bit about that initiative that you've been a part of starting?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my business is called Paradigm Shift. You can look up online, and it's twofold, but it really, like, these things intersect so much in that I want to train healthcare workers not only to be able to recognize exploitation, trafficking, sextortion, these things that we're seeing with kids that oftentimes have a tie to pornography, but also in being able to screen kids being affected by porn. Because I think a lot of clinicians, it's not even on their radar to say, have you been exposed to porn? How often are you looking at it? Are you struggling with erectile dysfunction? Is anybody screening boys for this? Probably not. But we know research shows that about a third of adolescent boys are struggling with some type of sexual dysfunction, which is huge. But again, I'm sure they're not coming up to their doctor and saying, I need help with this, So I think there's a lot of repercussions we're seeing from habitual porn use that no one's assessing in adolescence. I know with a lot of patients we see that are suicidal, there's an element of exploitation, sextortion, these types of trends that, again, is anybody asking these kids, what is causing you to feel hopeless? Is it because you sent nudes and now this person's asking you for $5,000? Right. So as at the hospital I work at, we have started to implement some of these questions.
That's good.
And the disclosures we're getting are so alarming. So I talked to a 17-year-old a couple of days ago. She had a long, just horrific life of sexual abuse. And I was asking her questions about, have you ever seen pornography? Have you ever sent naked photos? And she said, yeah, I started sending nudes when I was 11, when I was on dating sites. What? My mind is blown, of course, in the moment. I'm just like, okay, thanks for sharing that with me. But when we start to see these even historical trends with kids, it makes so much sense why they're feeling hopelessness and despair and overwhelmed. I think there's so much happening online that's related to pornography and exploitation that parents have no idea about. And so that's the goal of my business, is to help clinicians know how to do this in a trauma-informed way. And it's really effective. We saw that last year with the patients we screened, about 1 out of every 3 of them had some type of disclosure of exploitation, porn involvement, trafficking, whatever it may be. All these different crimes that we see that are sort of sexual abuse, and then some. 1 out of every 3. So imagine how many kids are just falling through the cracks in healthcare systems because these questions aren't being asked.
The thought that 1/3 of kids, are teenagers, are struggling with some form of sexual dysfunction, largely as a result of, pornography exposure and consumption. Where my mind went when you mentioned that is being at these pop culture retail stores, like Tilly's, for example, where Playboy merchandise is sold to 12 and 13-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And it just, there's still this very significant disconnect with pop culture and the impact of pornography. In other words, the idea that we're going to take this very wink, wink, nudge, nudge approach to porn as though it's kind of like the porn chic concept. Like, it's a little taboo, but like, that's kind of cool. And it's like, actually, it's not. It's just not.
Yeah.
When I see somebody with like a Playboy sticker on their car, or like wearing a Playboy shirt, like carrying on a Playboy purse, I'm like, it's not cool. There's actually nothing cool. It's not even rebellious. It's just gross. It's just it's a participation in a whole system of exploitation. It's like being proud of like child sweatshops.
Right.
Like, let me go get that branded. It's like, stop. You're not being rebellious. You're just deeply out of touch. I mean, because there's just so much information that we have now. There was that special, I believe it was on A&E, The Secrets of Playboy.
Yes. Horrifying.
I couldn't even get through the entire series because it's just so many stories of abuse. But that really ripped the veil off of the entire Playboy enterprise and who Hugh Hefner was as a man. Why are there still people out there trying to protect the legacy of this mega predator?
Right.
Now, we all, are broken in some way, shape, or form. It's not. So I'm not trying to create an us versus them mentality, but there are truly capital P predators who have built, an entire life and empire on predating on other people, vulnerable people. And that was Playboy. Like their entire history and legacy and everything was just a story of the sexual exploitation of, these attractive, vulnerable young females. And were some of them at some level participating in it? Yeah, sure. But there's a very coercive, manipulative backdrop to that. So I think the whole subject has to be completely reevaluated in light of this new information. And if you're a store like Tilly's, I'm like, I'm sorry, Tilly, if you're making money off of this, but is that money that you're making really worth continuing to promote the brand of an empire that was built on sexual exploitation? Like, and what? Like, what's the argument for that?
Right.
You think it's that 13-year-olds will think you're cool? Or I just, it boggles the mind. So I think that when it comes to that age group, that we just need so much more awareness, and we really need a countercultural movement to reverse the trend of this porn chic idea that has been, infiltrated our consciousness as a society. So talking with you, I'm like, who better to kind of like burst the bubble, if you will, than somebody who spends their entire life working on the front lines with the people who are the outworking of that. I'm sure the person who owns Tilly's isn't doing the math on and thinking about the implication, the trickle down implications of a pornographic culture. But that's why you're here, to help us measure that and go, this is awful and bad and disturbing and I don't want to hear it, but we need to hear it. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's where my lane went. There's a question in there somewhere.
I have a thought on all of that. I would say for kids today, the new sort of Playboy, like the porn chic, is OnlyFans. And so, what I have heard, and this is super disturbing. Again, like, I know this talk just gets more and more depressing and dark, but I talked to a school resource officer, and he was telling me that what teenage girls say to each other in high school now is only ugly girls get diplomas. And what they're saying to each other is, when you turn 18, you can get on OnlyFans, you can create porn and make, in their mind, tons of money. And you don't have to graduate from high school. You don't have to go to college. You don't have to get a job, because everyone at school is already asking you for nude photos. Why not make thousands of dollars off of it? And so I think, again, we don't think through all the implications for kids and how porn is just normalizing self-objectification. We took care of a 16-year-old. Again, this was a couple of weeks ago, so this is not like a story from a few years ago. A 16-year-old who came in, she had been sexually assaulted. And as we were screening her, as we were asking questions about her life, she was being trafficked through OnlyFans by her 17-year-old boyfriend who was keeping her money. So, like we see kids being trafficked through there. We see he was sextorting her. He was taking nude images and threatening her with those. And so I think that the trends are just shifting so quickly, and porn is just normalizing and creating so much abuse with these kids, right? Because obviously we have a 16-year-old and our social worker verified there were thousands and thousands of dollars being made off of her account. That means there's a whole bunch of buyers who are paying to watch a teenager.
There's something about the commercial sex transaction that just finds a way to be exploitative no matter what the distribution vehicle is. And the story just is over and over and over and over. And it's, when it was street prostitution, it's, well, yeah, but then there's escorting. And it was like, well, then we figured out escorting was a bunch of pimping and exploitation going on there too. And then it was like, well, then there's webcamming. And then it was there. And then there was like, now it's OnlyFans.
Yep.
It's there too. And like, yeah, but there's the ethical porn, and nope, it's there too. Like I just don't think that something as deeply powerful and potent and sensitive and vulnerable and mysterious and all of those things is meant to be sold.
Right.
And in the places where it is, we see this routine. And it seems so obvious to me that when there's a financial interest in it, it's so easy to manipulate and coerce and somebody into doing this, that, or the other, and then find themselves in a cycle of exploitation.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you shared that story because, we hear the arguments of like, yeah, but there's OnlyFans, and OnlyFans actually is probably one of the worst because of the multi-leveling marketing nature of it, the predatory recruitment model for it.
Yes.
That puts people in these situations. But so it sounds like you're seeing it in all these different fronts. Tell me, when somebody comes in, how do you hold somebody in that space who's experienced this trauma, this violation of their body, of their sexuality, of their spirit? How do you hold that person in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think everyone responds to trauma differently. So some patients are in disbelief, some minimize, some feel like it was their fault. Some are broken and are sobbing, some are angry. There's different ways that we kind of cope with experiencing something like that. And so I think for me, what I've found is really helpful is to believe them and validate. So it's just a lot of kind of attuning to what I'm seeing and asking a lot of open-ended questions, So thank you for sharing that with me. You're really brave. I'm sorry that happened to you. Can you tell me more about it? So there's not sort of this sense of I'm in an authority figure and I'm going to interrogate you about what happened and I don't believe you, or, you don't have any control. I want to make it feel very safe and just whatever you're comfortable sharing, and thanking them, sort of having this respect and dignity in that moment. Because I think a lot of times that's not what happens. Maybe you have, and not to dog on law enforcement. I work with lots of law enforcement who are incredible, but there are sometimes they come in and they do ask questions that are really inappropriate or make the patient feel like they don't believe me at all. Are they even going to take a report? Or same with Child Protective Services. Sometimes they come in and, they're kind of like, I don't know if I believe this kid. So I think to myself, it's not my job to figure out if they're telling the truth or not, which we know the vast majority of kids do not lie about sexual assault. To just say, I believe you. I'm going to be safe and just kind of feel out what you need in this moment. Sometimes kids act like, it was no big deal. Like that's their coping mechanism. And again, I try to validate, I'm sorry. I'm still sorry that happened to you, even if you feel like it's not a big deal. So I think a lot of it comes with experience too. It feels I would say I probably was very awkward at it at first, but to sit in the moment and just say, it's okay if it feels awkward. It's okay if there's silence. It's okay if they don't want to tell me everything. And I think experience has helped as well to kind of know how to be in that moment and not feel freaked out by it.
Before we started this, we were talking about a story of a story that just came out of a girl who was out drinking, needed a ride home, ended up getting raped by 4 men, dropped on the side of the road, and then ultimately was run over by another car and died. And reading that story was just so horrific, especially as a parent. And I know that as we're having this conversation, parents are going to be one of the most concerned and interested groups out there, in talking about all of this. And for any parent to be in a situation like this where their child has been in some way exposed or abused, that's a whole, there's a crisis that happens in that child, but there's a larger family crisis that occurs as a result of that as well. And I'm curious from your perspective, what you would say to parents out there to help protect their children, just thinking preventative, but then for ones who are maybe dealing with a crisis like this, how to help them navigate and sort of shepherd their child through something as horrific as this.
Yeah. So yes, that story makes me sick to my stomach. And just to touch on it really quickly, I think in thinking through, pornography's influence, do we know if these 4 men look at pornography? I mean, we could guess probably yes, but I think the elements we see in that is 4 of them raped this girl. We know gang rape is a huge theme in porn. There's no empathy. They did not take her home. They did not help her. She clearly could not consent to what was happening, and they left her on the side of the road. There's such a huge lack of empathy in pornography. So I think
there's a whole genre that is based on you pick somebody up, have sex with them in your vehicle, and then throw them off on the side of the road. I'm not even going to name the genre, but we discovered it when we were.
Of course, there is.
Right. Yeah. So to your point.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So do we know
it's a whole storyline.
They look at porn? Don't know, but could we guess based on what happened? It's entirely possible, So that story is so horrific, and I feel so terribly for her parents. But yeah, I actually just wrote an article for Defend Young Minds on this very subject of what to do if your child discloses. But first, I will address what to do if your kid is exposed to pornography. The unfortunate reality is it's probably going to happen if your kid has a device. So there was a study that just came out last week from Common Sense Media that showed that 73% of kids have seen porn by the age of 17. So 3 out of every 4 kids, teens, they see porn. It was saying that 44% of them are looking at porn through their school-issued devices. So almost half of these teens are looking at it through, the iPad they got from school or tablet or whatever it is, and that 1 out of 3 of them look at porn at school. So we think kids are sort of insulated or like, oh, the school gave them an iPad. That surely there's a filter, or surely this isn't happening at school. Oh, no, it's definitely happening at school. And a lot of kids are seeing porn, whether it's intentional or accidental. So I think for parents, if your kid has a device, they're going to see porn. So if you're going to give them a device, or if someone's going to give them a device, what parameters are you going to put in place? Like, that is just the blunt, honest truth of it. And so I think that, like, a lot of parents think, oh, no, not my kid. Yes, your kid. It could be accidental, right? But it's going to be your kid if they have a device. That's just the world we live in. So I think there's tons of resources that exist online. But if you want to know more, like, parents can come up with contracts with their kids, or there's different ideas of, like, don't let them have their device at night. Like, nothing good's happening on that phone at 2 a.m. I can guarantee it. Whether it's a predator talking to your kids, or they're looking at pornography, or whatever it may be, or people asking them for nudes. So there's lots of ideas online. I won't necessarily get into all of them, but I think parents just have to know that if you give your kid a device, they're going to see porn. That is just the way that it is. So if you don't want them to see porn, don't give them a device, or have a lot of really strict parameters in place. And then I would say, in terms of disclosure, So, of course, this is every parent's nightmare. Like, a lot of parents, of course, think my kid would never be sexually abused. And, of course, we would never want a child to be sexually abused. But it happens with great prevalence. And about 90% of kids who are sexually abused by someone they know. So it's usually a predator who's not just grooming the kid, they're grooming the whole family. So that when the kid discloses, it's like, oh no, Uncle Johnny or whoever, he would never do that. Absolutely not, because he's groomed this whole family into thinking he's amazing. So I would say for parents, number one, do not shut your kid down with that dismissal. There's no way that this is possible, because they're never going to disclose to you again. Because what you've said in that moment is, I don't believe you. I'm not a safe option for you. Of course, I understand as an adult how that would be your reaction when you're hearing that of like, I can't handle this. There's no way that's true. But what it says to this little kid is like, I can't hold that trauma for you, and I don't want to hear it. So if a kid discloses to the best of your ability, I know it's really hard because it's traumatic, to just say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. You know, we're going to protect you. So validate them. And then we need to protect kids, right? So if they're disclosing against someone, we don't put them around that person anymore. And there's kind of a whole string of things that need to happen on the legal side of things that I won't necessarily get into, but I would say you can take a child to an emergency department, a child advocacy center, a police station, and they will get the ball rolling in terms of like what needs to be reported, how to come up with a safety plan, those types of things, so that a child is not around this perpetrator. Unfortunately, only about 3% of child sexual abuse cases result in a jury conviction, which is crazy. I've testified in a few trials, I've seen hundreds of sexual assault victims. I think I've testified maybe 4 or 5 times. That's it. So very rarely does it ever even get to that place. Like sometimes there's plea deals. A lot of times it's what we call unsubstantiated. So basically there's just not enough evidence to move forward. But again, we know kids aren't lying about this. Research shows they don't lie. So it's important we believe them and support them and protect them. And again, I would say if you want kind of a more detailed list of what to do, if you just Google my name and Defend Young Minds, it'll come up.
We've built a world that favors adults at the expense of children.
Yes.
And it's sad, and it's a sociopathic kind of way of constructing a society. And I'm just such a huge believer that we do have to go back with a more empathetic lens and think about how can we create a world that prioritizes the protection of children. What you were saying about guarding against potential perpetrators that may be grooming the family, there's a documentary that came to mind called Abducted in Plain Sight. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that. It's such a haunting and alarming documentary about how this one person infiltrated this family, ultimately to get access to their daughter, but took the dad/husband for a ride, took the wife/mom for a ride, meaning emotionally, relationally, all this, and just did a number on this whole family. And it's really wild. Like, the family unit has to be protected. There are people out there that I would describe as squatters. They are people who are taking up all the relational equity in a family and have none of the responsibility. And parents and families have to be really protective of that sacred space, and especially in consideration of the protection of children. So yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. As we kind of wrap up this time, are there any other talking points that you normally touch on that we haven't hit on that you'd like to hit, or any other stories that stand out to you that would relate to anything we've discussed so far?
Yeah, I think sort of on the other side of things is that I didn't touch on is if a child is looking at pornography or sexually acting out on another kid, what do you do with that kid? And I think that's devastating for a family if you have, say a sibling who sexually assaults a younger sibling. As a parent, I can't imagine making that choice of, do we send this kid to live with someone else? How do we hold space for both of these kids that you love? And so there are different types of therapy specifically for problematic sexual behavior that work really well. And a lot of times the kids actually don't even have to be removed from the home if they finish these therapies out. That a lot of times, about 98% of the time, they will not reoffend. And of course, what we know is kids looking at pornography, there's usually other things going on. Like maybe they have attachment trauma or other types of trauma that have not been addressed or whatever it may be. There's things beneath the surface that they're using porn to cope with. And so we see there's really low recidivism rates for kids who are able to get therapy. And typically the families are incorporated in that as well. So I think that there's hope that if a kid is struggling with looking at pornography, is acting out, it doesn't mean that they're going to be like that for the rest of their life. Now, adult offenders are a whole different story. There's a very high recidivism rate. And kind of by that point, it's very hard to sort of rehab or whatever you want to say. A lot of times they're going to reoffend, especially if they're targeting children. So, but with kids, it's different, which is good. So I think that that's important to know, that it's not just like a lost cause or that this can't be fixed or that their brains can't grow new neural pathways. There is, I think, with kids more sort of hope that they're not going to continue to do this throughout their lifetime if we can get to the root of the issue, if we can get them to stop looking at pornography.
I'm not like a huge statistics person. I'm more interested in real stories and that thing, but statistics do have some value to quantify the scope and the scale of what we're talking about. Are there any statistics that come to mind as we have this conversation?
Yeah, there are a few. So there was a research study done a few years ago with thousands of kids in the United States. And what the researcher talked to the kids about was if they had been sexually abused and who abused them. And what he found and estimated is that in the United States, anywhere from a third to half of those committing sexual assaults are kids themselves. We see the same trend almost to the exact same numbers in the UK. So there's a nurse, kind of my counterpart there, and she's been gathering statistics and stories and looking through data. And that's exactly what she's saying. Anywhere from a third to half of their assaults are committed by juveniles as well. And so we see there's just a huge number of kids, and that's the same as at our hospital. A third to half are kids. In terms of pornography playing a role, there aren't as many, I would say, like hard statistics on, this kid looked at pornography and then they committed this assault. I don't think we have a good way of collecting that data at this point. But I would say kind of in what I've heard from other, SANE programs, child advocacy centers, things like that, the number is very high in terms of especially child-on-child sexual assault.
Wow. That's a new piece for me is connecting that dot of not just this child sexual abuse, but the fact of how many cases of those are peer-to-peer situations. And but I think just for me, like this whole conversation just again, like really brings into perspective some of what we've talked about, this idea that we're kind of in a way just taking an inventory for, my God, like what's happening right now in the culture. And as more studies are done, as more reporting is done on this, and as we're able to have more of these conversations, I do think that where I feel steered is just to address the widespread distribution and proliferation and normalization of pornography in our culture, and for us to say, we've got to pull up the reins on this and look at the ways that this industry and that this substance needs to be regulated, because it's wreaking havoc. And, we haven't talked a lot about the long-term consequences of child sexual abuse, but really, what we're talking about is people's potentially entire life being derailed and affected by this. I mean, there are people who late into life are still in therapy and still dealing with things that happened to them as a child related to that place of sexual abuse. So if if the health of our society is contingent on building healthy families and protecting those, I mean, what better way to destroy that than to undermine and derail and fracture someone's sexuality, their ability to connect intimately within the context of a partner and a family and growing and nurturing that. So it's not just these one-off cases. My takeaway from this conversation, like you said, there are daily kids that are showing up in these hospitals reporting instances of sexual abuse. So they're not one-off cases. And the larger effect of that is ultimately going to compromise the future health of families and of our society. So that may sound dramatic to some, but I truly feel there's no way to over-exaggerate the seriousness and the significance of this. And I'm very inspired by seeing the way that you have sustained your efforts on the front lines of holding the individual victims in the place of their exploitation, but then also being able to step back from that and provide counsel and insight and speak to this issue at a larger cultural level, joining us at the symposium in DC. So I just want to thank you on behalf of our whole team at Exodus Cry. You truly are an angel of light in a very dark situation. And I'm sure if I talk to many of these children, that they hold you in very high esteem. And I'm sure there's a great number of people who are very grateful for you out there. And so just thank you so much for all of your work. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for being willing to talk about this. You know, it's a rare sort of person that is willing to just hear it out and have an honest conversation. So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're unique as an organization in the sense that we're like interested in all the things that most people don't even want to hear about.
Yes. Yes.
So I don't know. It is like you said at the beginning, it's a calling.
Yes.
And but I'm glad to be in it with people like you and that we have this solidarity as we go about this work. So thanks again.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com and join the daily conversation by following Exodus Cry on all major social platforms.